Now to a story so stunning it's capturing the headlines around the world, and it's being played out in a remote corner of the Northern Territory. An American linguist claims to have discovered an entirely new language, literally in the stages of being born. Now it's being created by children and is neither a hybrid language nor a dialect, but a completely distinct language with its own grammar and structure. It is spoken by the Warlpiri people in a small village of only about 700 people, and according to the linguist from the University of Michigan, it is spoken exclusively by people under the age of 35. It also comes at a time when so many Indigenous languages of the world are being lost. Well, joining me now from Perth is Professor Alan Dench, Dean of Graduate Research School at the University of Western Australia. A pleasure to have you on the program, Professor. Is this rare to see a language apparently being born right before a linguist's eyes?
It's rare to see it's rare for linguists to see it happening before their eyes, but it's probably not as rare as we might imagine. I mean, new languages or new varieties of languages develop all the time in various kinds of circumstances, but they're often ephemeral. They disappear fairly quickly, and we don't necessarily notice their existence and notice their passing.
Now, how does a language like this start to come into existence? Is it a combination of isolation? What is unique about a language that appears to have developed out of children speaking it?
Well, this particular variety that's called light Warlpiri has developed more or less in a small community where kids are exposed to a number of languages. They are exposed to traditional Warlpiri, of course, that their parents and grandparents speak. They're exposed to a Creole that's based originally on English, that's spoken by Aboriginal communities across the Northern Territory. And of course they're exposed to the English that they see in the media like this. And what happens sometimes in small communities, or in many communities that are multilingual, is that people switch between languages in their everyday discourse. They kind of put a few words of this and a few words of that. And what you can end up with in some circumstances, like in this circumstance, is a kind of systemization of the kind of mixing of the two codes or two or three codes. And then the kids seem to have picked that up and somehow fixed it. They've learnt a grammar for it and developed their own grammatical structures for it that kind of, if in a way, sort of freezes or solidifies at least a mixing, a code switching that's come from their parents.
How does this then distinguish itself from the formal Warlpiri language, and also why is it not considered to be a hybrid language, a type of Creole?
Well, we call it a mixed language. It's different from a Creole, and I can explain the subtle differences, but it's not Warlpiri because it doesn't share its grammar with Warlpiri. It's got a quite different grammar. What you can see in light Warlpiri is that the nouns, the sort of words for things, etc., and most of the noun phrases come mostly from Warlpiri. The verbs come from English. And then various other grammatical markers are a bit mixed, but actually in some cases what makes this particular case somewhat unique is that we can see that it's developed other grammatical structures completely independently. So the children have innovated, or the community has innovated some grammatical structures that come from neither Warlpiri on the one hand nor from English.
Is this likely to then usurp the former Warlpiri or the coexisting formal Warlpiri language? Are we likely to see that one go and the light Warlpiri spoken by a new generation really usurp that?
It's really impossible to know. I mean, I think we can, at this stage, I imagine we can't tell exactly what direction it's going to take. Typically what happens in a situation like this is not that Warlpiri is disappearing, at least there are many speakers of that still, and of course Creole is still used in the community and English is there as well, but these other varieties, all of these varieties have a different function for their speakers. They have different roles to play. Speakers use them for different things. And so really, these varieties will be maintained as long as each of them has a role to play for their speakers and an importance. There's no reason to imagine that light Warlpiri might necessarily push out traditional Warlpiri. The opposite could happen, and both could disappear in the face of English, as is happening for many languages. But we can't really be entirely certain, and I guess that's what makes the case so fascinating, because we have the opportunity to see this evolution, this development in progress.
And also fascinating that it's being spoken by people largely under the age of 35. Is this also traditional that a language would become the domain of one separate sector of the community to the exclusion of others?
Well, ask any grandparent who can't understand what their teenage grandchildren are saying. I mean, this is normal. I mean, I think that what we see is change happens through time, and languages change remarkably fast, which is why grumpy old men don't like what the little kids are saying and write to the newspapers about it. But so it's not unusual to see the change most obvious, I guess, in young speakers. And the question is, will it stay confined to young speakers? Will it become a marker of young people's speech? Or will it become something that then they carry through with them until the older age and pass on to their children and children's children? So we can't really know that yet.
It's interesting as well that you've touched on just a moment ago how English will often usurp the other languages, and you'll see traditional language disappear. Does something like this give heart to languages being preserved in isolation like this?
I mean, it's difficult for languages to. I mean, it depends on the communities that that exist and the different communities that people are members of. In a small community of a few hundred people, they can preserve their language if it performs an important function for them as speakers. But there's always a risk that that because of the wider communities that they're part of, they're part of a wider Creole-speaking community, part of a wider Warlpiri-speaking community, and of course part of a wider worldwide English-speaking community, that the pressures of those different languages and the need to be members of those larger communities can effectively wipe out the smaller languages.
Just finally, Professor, to look worldwide, how much are Indigenous languages in particular really under threat right now?
Under great threat. We've estimated, linguists have estimated in over the last 20 years that we expect to lose half the world's languages within our lifetimes. So this is happening on a world scale. Australia is pretty good at killing off languages, I have to say. It's not something to be particularly proud of. We've lost many languages in this country, but it's happening all over the world. And it's interesting, we imagine that languages with huge numbers of speakers will be immune to this kind of change, but it's not necessarily the case. You can take a language as large as, say, Javanese, which has 87 million speakers, and find that in cities, children are not speaking Javanese, they're learning Bahasa Indonesia instead. And you can imagine, if you project from that over a number of generations, a language that now has tens of millions of speakers might end up with many fewer speakers.
Yeah, extraordinary. This is a fascinating example in the Territory. Professor, a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you once again.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dan.